In this pod-slice summary of the Modern Wisdom podcast, Chris Williamson and Patrick Bet-David explore the concept of competition and the idea of having enemies as drivers of success. Bet-David stresses the role of competition and rivalry, even arguing that people are useless if they're not competing and need enemies to drive them. He emphasizes that everyone has enemies but are often concealed due to fear, insecurities, or social conventions. Examining the makeup of successful figures, Bet-David highlights the trait of having an enemy to compete against and despises naivety towards this fact. He suggests choosing your enemies wisely, as the right rival can bring the best out of you. He uses an anecdote of the UK's Winston Churchill to illustrate that the biggest obstacle often lies within ourselves, not outside of us. Bet-David proposes that rivalry and competition can unveil aspects of ourselves that remain hidden in their absence. The thrill of competition, according to Bet-David, is akin to falling in love. The risk and connected emotions drive us to become better versions of ourselves. However, one must tread carefully not to lose control and become reckless, reinforcing the importance of selecting enemies wisely. Williamson, on the other hand, articulates his reticence towards conflict and his preference for peace. However, he notes that dismissing rivalry or competitive struggles may result in missing out on significant motivation. He describes enemies as powerful catalysts that can shape an individual, given they don't let hate, fear, or scarcity overtake them for a prolonged period. Both guests agree that the concept of having enemies is not purely negative. Instead, it's like alchemy, turning something allegedly toxic and useless, the spirit of rivalry, into valuable drive and motivation. Bet-David reinforces this notion, suggesting that a formidable enemy could introduce you to a side of yourself never seen before. Moreover, Bet-David identifies the 3 essential factors for success by using Tom Brady as an example: experiencing unconditional love, encountering someone who brings immense pain, and forming a connection with a person who is continually challenging them to be better. These combinations act as the fuel for cultivating resilience, ambition, and ultimately success. In the continuation of the podcast, Williamson and Bet-David delve deeper into the compelling argument about the role of enemies as a driving force towards success. Bet-David emphasizes the importance of choosing the right enemies, explaining how poorly chosen rivals can foster feelings of entitlement and victimhood that paralyze rather than propel individuals towards success. Bet-David further unravels this idea through a detailed comparison between competitors and enemies. Drawing from sports analogies, he points out how some athletes are competitive, but few reach an exceptional level. He cites NBA legends Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan as models of individuals whose competitive spirit transcended to going after their rivals rather than merely going against them. Their success hinged on their ability to maintain emotional control and motivation amid intense rivalry. Bet-David offers a perspective that this fierce drive was fueled by their enemy mindset. Returning to the conversation, the duo discussed the backstory and legacy of Churchill further, reinforcing one of Bet-David's key points, that our greatest enemies often lie within us. However, managing and using this internal rivalry to fuel our motivation can lead to historical change, like the one Churchill was able to achieve. On the other hand, erroneously chosen enemies or conflicts can be toxic and display a signal of low status, as reflected in the behavior of individuals who can't shed the chip on their shoulder. They then transition to discussing how guerrilla-style tactics, considered ungentlemanly, were revolutionized by Churchill during the Second World War. This exemplified how the essence of rivalry and competition could usher in much-needed change and innovation when embraced in the right spirit. Chris Williamson contemplates this strategy shift, concluding that strategies that got us here might not necessarily take us there. As such, the way we choose and manage our enemies, rivals, or conflicts fundamentally shapes our journey to success. These insights challenge listeners to reconsider their approach towards competition and rivals, encouraging them to view these enemies as catalysts for personal and professional growth, rather than setbacks or threats. By doing so, they can turn the seemingly toxic and useless into a valuable drive and motivation. The podcast discussion between host Chris Williamson and guest Patrick Bet-David centers on the power dynamics in various aspects of life, including sports, politics, and business. The conversation begins by examining Churchill's unconventional, yet successful reliance on guerrilla-style warfare. Bet-David and Williamson agree that there's a parallel in the business world, where startups often employ renegade tactics to disrupt the status quo and make huge societal impacts. sharp transitions are made to explore leadership styles in evolutionary psychology. Prestige and dominance-based leadership are highlighted with examples like wartime leaders and business tycoons like Steve Jobs and John Scully. Bet David asserts that individuals should evolve and shed old enemies as they mature, and their drive should be fueled by different motivators. The duo then analyzes the impact of cultural narratives in shaping public discourse, grounding this discussion with examples from pop culture influencers such as Ben Shapiro. They also touch on the concept of enemies of convenience, seen in the creation of feuds for public spectacle. An example is given of Daily Wire's cultural war on children's movies, specifically Snow White as depicted by Disney. The conversation leads to the reception of feminist narratives that portray men as enemies. They posit that this could lead to unforeseen long-term consequences, such as loneliness and regret for women. References include the recent Disney flops, which they attribute to a misalignment with parent audiences, suggesting Disney has chosen the wrong enemies and allies. Discussing successful opposing stances, they highlight the strategic responses of companies, such as Daily Wire and Hershey's, to campaigns they oppose. Their quick reaction created an opportunity for these companies, suggesting entrepreneurial success requires opposition. The role of market forces in determining the success of companies and individuals comes under discussion. The conversation rounds off with a discussion on the resilience and adaptability required in business, symbolized by Apple's potential interest in Disney's failures. This segment emphasizes the need to align with market demands and underscores the dangers of choosing the wrong battles. The conversation continues with a discussion on the merit of hard work and the true value of success. The point is driven home using a personal anecdote from the host, Chris Williamson, about his appearance on Joe Rogan's show. Rogan's quote, "Just because something is hard to obtain does not mean it's valuable," sparks a conversation about how people often mistake the striving for and acquisition of material possessions as a sign of true value. Through a blend of historical examples, such as how the exotic and rare pineapple was highly prized in the past, they underscore that symbols of wealth don't equate to real value. A foundational premise of their discussion is that genuine value derives from relationships, self-confidence, peace of mind, sanity, and the ability to positively impact the people around you. The debate then moves into how the current dating scene is seen as a transaction or a game, pointing to the rise of dating apps and the loss of traditional courtship methods. Bet David shares his own experiences and his approach toward finding a life partner, placing emphasis on depth and understanding rather than superficial appeal. The dialogue transitions into how relationships within a business are indicative of a person's values. Bet David talks about finding value, not from the external signs of a person's success, such as cars or houses, but from their values, principles, and how they treat and interact with other people. They delve into the significance of knowing what to be impressed by, cautioning against being dazzled by material wealth or items just because they're hard to get. They reflect on the danger of getting caught up in the game of success and losing sight of the essential depth that lies below the surface of this game. To conclude this segment, they explore how one's relative level of comfort, freedom, and impact on others should be preferable parameters for evaluating success and impressiveness. During Chris Williamson's in-depth discussion with entrepreneur and motivational speaker Patrick Bet David, the debate often centers around a wide array of topics, starting from success, value, and personal fulfillment to business ethics and leadership. Both, Williamson and Bet David, agree upon the notion that the real value in life doesn't come from attaining material possessions, but rather from enriching relationships, self-confidence, sanity, and the positive impact one can have on others. The podcast further explores the modern dating scene, a sphere often deemed transactional and likened to a game due to the rise of dating apps and decline of traditional courtship. Bet David shares insights into his approach towards finding a life partner, favoring depth of connection over superficial attraction. Interestingly, there are intricate discussions about how one's values are reflected in their business relationships. Bet David emphasizes that the true measure of an individual isn't derived from their accumulation of material possessions such as cars or houses, but the values they live by and how they interact with others. The hosts then delve into the crucial skill of discerning what one should be genuinely impressed by, cautioning the audience against being swayed by material wealth just because they are difficult to acquire. They urge listeners to resist getting entangled in the game of success and to not lose sight of the deep-rooted values beneath surface-level achievements. Further into the conversation, the focus shifts towards the subject of success and its parameters. Williamson and Bet David suggest that comfort levels, personal freedom, and our impact on others should serve as far more representative markers for evaluating success and impressiveness than wealth or possessions. Narrating examples from their personal and professional lives, the hosts emphasize being thoughtful and selective about one's goals, aligning oneself with values rather than flashy symbols of prosperity. They each draw from their experiences in the business world and life at large, advocating for self-awareness, clarity of vision, and an unwavering commitment to personal values. In a nutshell, the podcast focuses on reframing how success is defined, advocating for a shift away from material possession towards true human values. As the conversation unfolds, it forms a clarion call for deeper introspection, value-based living, and pursuing genuine fulfillment, rather than chasing empty symbols of success. The conversation remains a riveting exploration of the nuances of success, authenticity, and value, offering valuable insights for anyone seeking to understand the less obvious facets of achieving success. While material accomplishments may be important, they argue, real value comes from personal growth, authentic relationships, and an unwavering commitment to one's principles. Continuing with the discussion on the Modern Wisdom podcast, host Chris Williamson and guest Patrick Bet David take a deep dive into the concept of capitalism and the free market, illustrating how these dynamics can create solutions and filter out insincere actors over time. Here, Bet David paints capitalism as an impartial force that is only interested in results, not flattery or sympathy. On a deeper level, Bet David's perspective transcends economic systems, focusing instead on the importance of understanding and engaging with multiple perspectives. He highlights his approach of bringing together contrasting views, as he did with Christians and Muslims on his own podcast, as a way of fostering understanding and finding common ground. Topics such as the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine serve to illustrate this method, with Bet David stressing the importance of asking hard questions and listening to different sides. Additionally, Bet David touch on the question of responsibility to comment on contemporary issues. They argue that if you have a connection to an issue, or if you run a platform that regularly discusses such matters, then you have an obligation to address it. However, this should not translate to an obligation to support any particular side, but rather to share an educated perspective based on one's experiences and knowledge. The discussion also delves into the role of significant influencers in commenting on global issues. They discuss the potential dangers of uneducated commentary adding to noise rather than contributing to understanding, but also the responsibility attached to platforms with broad reach. In essence, they suggest that those with substantial platforms may have a responsibility to engage with crucial issues, but only if they have the knowledge to contribute constructively. Significantly, Williamson and Bet David also reflect on the fine balance between providing insightful commentary and remaining true to a platform's brand. While Bet David admits that he feels an obligation to comment on certain issues due to his Armenian and Assyrian descent and Iranian birthplace, they both agree that an individual should only branch into commentary on sensitive topics if it aligns with their brand and previous content. This should also be done with careful judgment and a commitment to thorough research to avoid spreading misinformation or creating unnecessary controversy. Throughout, the conversation remains firmly rooted in respect for diverse perspectives, a call for critical thinking, and recognition of the power and responsibility that comes with having a significant platform. In this part of the discussion on the Modern Wisdom podcast, Chris Williamson and Patrick Bet David dig deeper into the role of influencers, the rise of skepticism, and how the shift from mainstream media to the world of podcasting impacts how information is shared. Bet David notes one of the biggest challenges influencers face, striking a balance between maintaining their brand identity and offering amplification to world issues. In essence, influencers should be prepared to conduct extensive research and inquiry before commenting on sensitive topics, particularly issues which fall outside of their usual scope of content creation. Bet David also observes that skepticism and cynicism are on the rise, creating a vacuum for interpretation and understanding, causing many people to lose faith in institutional and mainstream voices. In the US, he recounts that trust in mainstream media and government is at an all-time low. This trend has empowered the voices in the podcasting space, the so-called amateurs, to challenge established narratives. It has also driven major digital platforms such as Spotify to place increased emphasis on user-generated content and authenticity, thereby changing the way content is consumed. Despite popularity and fame, even globally recognized figures like Obama and Kim Kardashian were dropped by Spotify, underscoring that podcasting is not an easy field to thrive in and requires distinct skill sets, irrespective of an individual's status. Moreover, Bet David imparts a perspective on how the world of communication and content sharing might look in the near future, suggesting that dependence on big pharma advertising props up the mainstream media. If a legislative change were to be made and pharmaceutical advertising in mainstream media were banned, it would cause a significant shift in the information landscape. Drawing on this POV, Bet David emphasizes the critical role users like podcasters are playing in this era. They're carving out the future of sense-making, offering people the kind of authenticity, insight, and understanding they crave, something mainstream media currently struggles to provide. Lastly, they touch on the topic of commentators being compelled to adhere to the advertiser's narrative. Bet David uses the example of Chris Cuomo, a popular figure on CNN, being fired due to a dispute, underscoring that those working in mainstream media operate under constraints that don't necessarily exist in the podcasting world. Consequently, a shift towards non-traditional platforms brings the promise of more freedom of speech and authenticity. Bet David predicts that with the possible sinking of mainstream media, the landscape of content creation and information dissemination will revolutionize, favoring those who can capture and hold their audience's attention through an authentic narrative. During this portion of the Modern Wisdom podcast, Chris Williamson and Patrick Bet David delve into the challenges of raising children in an affluent society, the impact of family structure, and the long-lasting effects of policy decisions. Bet David explains why he believes immigrants often outpace native-born citizens in wealth accumulation within a decade, attributing this to their hard-working mentality and drive to succeed. He points out that American policies have incentivized behaviors that are not conducive to wealth creation or societal stability, resulting in undesired social outcomes. One of Bet David's main concerns is raising his children in such a way that they will not become entitled. He mentions that he has consulted with estate planners to create a structure that demands responsibility and achievement from his children before they can inherit. He applauds other families with similar structures who sustain their wealth over multiple generations. Bet David speaks about a balance between providing opportunities for one's children and nurturing a sense of responsibility in them. He emphasizes that he would like his children to remain close to him and possibly run one of his businesses in the future. Furthermore, Bet David notes that policy decisions have long-term effects. He mentions the shift from 4% of children being born to single mothers in 1940 in America to more than 40% being born to single mothers now. He attributes this shift to policies that incentivized single motherhood, which he believes has led to societal problems, including increased crime rates. The conversation then pivots towards the idea of voting rights. Bet David believes that the right to vote should depend on contribution to society rather than age. He would want someone who has had a job and paid taxes to be able to vote rather than someone older who's never worked or paid taxes. In this part of the podcast, Bet David emphasizes the importance of creating and maintaining standards, providing opportunities, and encouraging wholesome family structures. He paints a picture of societies where encouraging the right behaviors can lead to a wealthier nation with stronger family units. In this part of the podcast, Patrick Bet David and Chris Williamson discuss the concept of success making people soft. Bet David discusses the idea of burden and responsibility. He believes that the responsibility of leadership is not glamorous or attractive, but it is essential for societal stability and progress. He emphasizes that burden is not something that can be easily sold, but it is an honor to bear the responsibility of leading a nation or an institution. Bet David further claims that there is a reason that people are attracted to the burden of leadership, because someone has to do it. He talks about the weight of being a founder or a number one person. This role carries the burden of selling the dream, the vision, maintaining composure even during financial crises, and bearing sleepless nights. The conversation then shifts to the notion of power. The guest points out that many people don't believe that the president is the most powerful person, but instead, alliances and the combination of wealth and influence wield the real power. He mentions how some very powerful and wealthy individuals may aspire to have absolute control, but avoid the public scrutiny that comes with being a president. Bet David also mentions his belief that certain people with significant ambition and wealth might have aspirations for global control. The discussion concludes with the thought-provoking revelation of an individual viewing themselves as an apex predator, which sparked a conversation about those who possess the motivation and resources to enact their plans, not necessarily for the benefit of others. This highlights the potential dangers of unchecked power and ambition. Bet David's central theme throughout this part of the discussion was about understanding the responsibilities that come with power, success, and wealth. He encourages the listeners to consider the weight of burden and responsibility that accompanies those who lead and make significant decisions for society. It's a look behind the scenes of power dynamics, emphasizing that, although it's challenging, it's necessary to carry the burden of leading for the betterment of society. The conversation between Patrick Bet David and Chris Williamson extends to the dynamics of power and the addictive nature it holds. Reflecting on the instances from history, Bet David emphasizes that some individuals who feel disrespected or offended choose to exert authority and control to validate their ego, sometimes leading to detrimental outcomes for society. This quest for power might not be entirely based on attaining wealth, but rather influence and control to manipulate laws and societal structures. Digging deeper into power dynamics, Bet David raises significant questions about the organizations that wield power, such as the G20 or UN. The podcast speculates on the possibility of unseen strings pulling these organizations from the backgrounds, leaving the listeners to ponder about the unseen facets of power. Linking the discussion back to responsibility, Bet David touches upon the significance of the right person on top of an authority hierarchy. He draws attention to how the misuse of power, especially in leadership roles, can lead to ominous outcomes. To clarify, he emphasized that money, while a catalyst, is not always the sole driving factor for these power players. The conversation then turns to the tension between self-love and high standards, drawn from a friend's revelation during a psilocybin journey in Australia. Williamson illustrates the questioning of whether individuals love us for who we are or what we do. Touching upon this duality, the podcast stresses the demand to show up for ourselves with the same love and periodic forgiveness we expect from the world. The articulate analysis of high performers, the drive for growth, and the necessity of self-love brings another dimension to the conversation. In understanding relationships from this perspective, Bet David puts forth the importance of an honest exchange in both personal and professional spheres. He posits, based on his corporate experience, that most people are wired to ask, "What's in it for me?" Drawing from this understanding, Bet David then pivots to explore the idea of selflessness versus selfishness, making a strong case that it's crucial to have a balance of both. The podcast concludes with the idea that only a few people, those you might consider your ride or die, would stick with you through thick and thin. Resonating with the audience, this theme of understanding power, maintaining balance, and appreciating our true believers stands as a central idea in this given section of the podcast. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of The Pod Slice.